Imagine living a life adjacent to a throne, a life of unimaginable privilege, and yet of profound hidden sorrow. For most of her 90 years, one woman lived this life, a silent sentinel standing guard at the gates of royal history. She was the keeper of secrets for the Queen's rebellious sister, a woman who saw the tears behind the tiaras and the heartache behind the headlines. For over half a century, she upheld the unspoken code of the aristocracy, loyalty above all, and silence as a sacred duty. But what happens when the people you've protected are gone? What happens when the gilded cage you've lived in finally opens? This is the story of Lady Anne Glenconner. It's a story of a life lived in the shadow of the crown, a story of unthinkable tragedy and the astonishing decision at the age of 87 to finally break a lifetime of silence. To truly grasp the world that shaped Lady Anne, we must travel back in time to a Britain that feels almost like a foreign country. The year of her birth, 1932, was the interwar period, a time when the rigid class structures of the Edwardian era were still very much intact, though the first cracks were beginning to show. For the aristocracy, life was a carefully choreographed performance of duty, tradition, and social obligation. It was a world of country estates, London seasons, debutante balls, and marriages that were often as much about dynastic alliance as they were about love. Anne Veronica Coke was born into the very apex of this world. She was the eldest daughter of the 5th Earl of Leicester, a lineage that could be traced back for centuries. Her home was not merely a house, it was Holcombe Hall, a breathtaking Palladian masterpiece set amidst thousands of acres of rolling Norfolk parkland. Holcombe wasn't just a symbol of wealth, it was a living museum, a testament to the enduring power and influence of a handful of families who had, for generations, owned much of the land and held significant sway over the nation's politics and culture. Life there was governed by a rhythm of shooting parties, formal dinners, and the quiet, unshakable belief in one's place in the world. And just a short drive away, through the same windswept Norfolk countryside, lay another grand estate, Sandringham, the beloved private residence of the British royal family. This proximity was more than just geographical. It was social, political, and deeply personal. The Cokes and the Windsors were not just neighbors, they were friends. It was in this idyllic, rarefied atmosphere that a young Anne Coke found her first playmates, 2 young princesses who would one day become the most famous women in the world. Princess Elizabeth, the serious and dutiful heir, and her younger sister, Princess Margaret Rose, a bundle of mischief, charm, and burgeoning charisma. Free from the public gaze, they were simply Lilibet, Margaret, and Anne. They played their childhood games unfolding across the manicured lawns and hidden gardens of these vast estates. This early unfettered friendship, particularly the bond forged between Anne and Margaret, would become the central pillar of Lady Anne's life. It was a connection born in innocence, long before the immense weight of destiny would descend upon them all, shaping their lives in ways none of them could have possibly imagined. This was the world that created Lady Anne Glenconner, a world of immense privilege, but also of immense expectation, where the greatest lessons taught were those of duty, discretion, and the unwavering importance of keeping up appearances, no matter the private cost. The end of the Second World War brought profound change to Britain. The old certainties were crumbling, and the nation was entering an age of austerity. Yet for a brief, dazzling moment in 1953, the country paused to look back at its imperial grandeur with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. It was a spectacle designed to inspire a nation and project an image of stability and tradition onto a changing world. At the very heart of this ancient ceremony, inside the hallowed walls of Westminster Abbey, stood 20-year-old Anne Coke. She had been granted one of the highest honors available to a young aristocratic woman, to serve as a maid of honor to the new queen. This was no small role. Dressed in an exquisite gown designed by Norman Hartnell, the same designer responsible for the queen's own breathtaking dress, Anne was part of the inner sanctum. Her task, along with the 5 other maids of honor, was to carry the queen's impossibly long, heavy velvet train. She later recalled the sheer weight of it, the intense concentration required not to stumble under the gaze of millions watching around the world on the new medium of television. It was a moment of immense historical significance, and for Anne, it was a profound personal experience. It solidified her place within the royal orbit, a public affirmation of her family's standing and her own proximity to the monarchy. But more than that, it was a front row seat to her childhood friend's ascension to the role that would define her life. It was a day of pomp and circumstance, but for Anne, it was also a day tinged with the private knowledge of the person beneath the crown, the friend she had known since childhood. In the quiet moments before the procession began, away from the cameras, Anne saw not a monarch, but her friend Lilibet. She saw the flicker of nervousness in her eyes, the sheer youth of the woman who was about to take on such an immense burden. There was a brief, shared glance between them, a silent acknowledgement that went beyond sovereign and subject. It was a look that said, "Can you believe this is happening?" And in that instant, the grand spectacle became deeply, profoundly personal. During the ceremony itself, the moment that truly struck Anne was the anointing. It's the most sacred part of the service, a moment so holy that it was hidden from the television cameras by a silk canopy. The queen had to remove her glittering robes and diadem, and she sat in a simple white dress, looking vulnerable and very young. From her position, Anne could see the solemn expression on her friend's face as the archbishop touched her with holy oil. In that quiet, stripped-back moment, she wasn't Queen Elizabeth II, ruler of an empire. She was a young woman making a solemn vow, dedicating her entire being to her people and to God. For Anne, watching on, it felt as though she was witnessing a soul-deep transformation, the final irreversible moment where her childhood playmate truly became the vessel of an ancient duty. And then, just like that, it was over. The crown was placed, the oaths were sworn, and the abbey erupted with cries of, "God save the Queen!" The walk back down the aisle was a blur of sound and color, but the most overwhelming sensation was stepping out of the abbey's cool, dim light and into the roar of the world outside. It was a physical force, a wave of sound from hundreds of thousands of people who had waited for hours in the rain just for a glimpse. The sheer, unbridled joy on their faces was breathtaking. It was the sound of a nation pinning its hopes and its heart on the young woman whose train Anne was so carefully carrying. It was no longer just an abstract idea of monarchy. It was a living, breathing covenant between a queen and her people, and Anne was walking right in the middle of it. 3 years after the coronation, in 1956, Anne embarked on the path expected of a woman of her station. She married. Her choice of husband, however, was anything but conventional. Colin Tennant, the future 3rd Baron Glenconner, was a charismatic, energetic, and wildly eccentric figure. He was a man of grand visions and even grander passions, known for his lavish parties and a temper that could flare as brightly as his charm. Their wedding was the society event of the year, a fairy tale occasion with a guest list that included Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret, who served as a bridesmaid. From the outside, it was a perfect match, a union of 2 prominent aristocratic families. But the reality of their 54-year marriage would be far more complex and tumultuous. Colin was a man of immense contradictions. He was capable of great generosity and creativity, yet also possessed a volatile and often cruel streak. He was openly unfaithful, and his unpredictable behavior created a life for Anne that was a constant whirlwind of social excitement and private distress. She would later write with startling honesty about his difficult nature, the public humiliations she endured, and the deep emotional challenges of being married to a man who lived life entirely on his own terms. Theirs was a partnership that would produce 5 children and take them to the sun-drenched shores of the Caribbean, but it was also a union that would test her resilience to its very limits. The early years of their marriage were a social whirl. They were at the heart of London's elite, a glamorous couple known for their extravagant hospitality. But Colin's greatest and most famous project lay thousands of miles away. In 1958, he purchased the small, undeveloped Caribbean island of Mystique for £45,000. It was a remote, beautiful, but basic place with no running water or electricity. To everyone else, it seemed like a foolish indulgence. To Colin, it was a blank canvas. His vision was to transform it into an exclusive hideaway for the rich and famous, a private paradise far from the prying eyes of the press. As a wedding present to Princess Margaret, who was then mired in the public heartbreak of her failed romance with the divorcee Peter Townsend, Colin offered her a plot of land on the island. At first, the princess was hesitant, but she eventually accepted. It was this gift that would forever link Mystique with the image of royal rebellion and glamour. The island became Princess Margaret's sanctuary, a place where she could escape the rigid confines of royal protocol. It was here, on the white sandy beaches and in the luxurious villas, that she could truly be herself, surrounded by a coterie of artists, musicians, and aristocrats, and at the center of it all, hosting the legendary parties and managing the island's development, were Lord and Lady Glenconner. Anne, as always, was the calm, elegant hostess, the steadying force amidst her husband's flamboyant chaos and the princess's social whirl. In 1971, Anne's role as a friend and confidant to Princess Margaret was formalized. She was appointed as a lady-in-waiting, a position she would hold until the princess's death in 2002. This was more than an honorary title. It was a demanding full-time commitment. A lady-in-waiting is a companion, a personal assistant, a social secretary, and a buffer to the outside world. Anne's duties were varied and relentless. She would accompany the princess on grueling royal tours, standing for hours in receiving lines, making polite conversation with dignitaries, and ensuring every detail of the itinerary ran smoothly. She would help manage the princess's wardrobe, her correspondence, and her punishingly busy schedule. But the most crucial part of her role was unspoken. She was the princess's emotional support system. She was the one who was there after a difficult public engagement, the one who listened to her frustrations, the one who shared in her moments of joy and her periods of deep despair. She witnessed firsthand the immense pressure Margaret was under. The princess was a woman of great intelligence and artistic sensibility, but her official role was often ill-defined. She was trapped in the impossible position of being royal, but not the monarch. She had the restrictions of royalty without the ultimate purpose. Behind closed doors, the princess was a revelation. She could be incredibly funny, a brilliant mimic with a wicked sense of humor. She adored the arts and would spend hours playing the piano with remarkable skill or discussing the ballet with an expert's passion. In these moments, Anne saw the woman Margaret might have been in another life, perhaps a pianist, an actress, or a designer. It was a world away from the stiff formality of cutting ribbons and shaking hands. This was the brilliant, vibrant core of her friend. And Anne understood that a huge part of her job was to protect that space, to allow the princess a place where she didn't have to perform, where she could simply be herself. It was, however, a delicate dance. The frustrations of her role could boil over, leading to the famous flashes of temperament that the press so eagerly reported. Anne learned to be an emotional barometer, to sense the shifts in the atmosphere. She knew when to listen, when to offer a cheerful distraction, and when to simply be a quiet, calming presence in the room. This wasn't something you could be trained for. It came from a deep, intuitive understanding of her friend, built over years of shared trust. It was about weathering the storms together, knowing that the outbursts came from a place of real pain and a feeling of being fundamentally misunderstood. It went far beyond a job description. It was a fierce, protective loyalty. Anne's role wasn't just to manage the princess's diary, but to shield her spirit. She was the guardian of her friend's private self, the keeper of her confidence, and the unwavering ally who saw and valued the magnificent, complicated, and often wounded woman behind the royal façade. For 3 decades, she walked that tightrope, a constant, steady presence in the turbulent, dazzling, and ultimately tragic life of Princess Margaret. Anne saw the devastating fallout from Princess Margaret's marriage to the charismatic but volatile photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, the Earl of Snowdon. Theirs was a union that began with modern, swinging 60s glamour, but descended into a bitter war of public sniping and private infidelity, culminating in the first major royal divorce since the reign of Henry VIII. Anne was a silent witness to the pain and humiliation Margaret endured. She was there during the later years, as Margaret's health began to fail, a series of strokes robbing her of her famous vitality. Through it all, Anne remained a constant, a bedrock of loyalty in the shifting sands of the princess's often turbulent life. She was the keeper of the memories, both the dazzling and the dark. While Lady Anne's public life was dedicated to serving the crown, her private world was being shattered by a series of unimaginable tragedies. The polished facade of aristocratic duty concealed a depth of personal suffering that would have broken most people. Her story is a stark reminder that privilege is no shield against the cruelest blows of fate. The first tragedy struck her eldest son, Charlie. In the mid-1980s, Charlie, who was gay, contracted HIV. This was at the height of the AIDS epidemic, a time of widespread fear, ignorance, and cruel prejudice. The diagnosis was a death sentence, and the stigma surrounding the disease was immense. For a family as prominent as the Glenconners, it was a private agony that had to be navigated with extreme care. Lady Anne and Colin transformed a section of their home into a private hospice, determined to care for their son themselves. They nursed him with unwavering love and devotion, shielding him from the judgment of the outside world. Anne later spoke of the profound pain of watching her vibrant son waste away and the quiet dignity with which he faced his illness. Charlie passed away in 1987. His loss was a devastating blow, a private grief born behind the public mask of composure. Just a few years earlier, another of her sons, Henry, had suffered a terrible accident that led him down a dark path. After a near-fatal motorcycle crash, Henry became addicted to the painkillers he was prescribed, an addiction that soon spiraled into a dependency on heroin. For years, Anne and her family endured the harrowing cycle of addiction, hope, and relapse. They tried everything to help him, from rehab clinics to constant support at home, but the grip of the drug was too strong. In 1990, just a few years after Charlie's death, Henry died from hepatitis C, a consequence of his long battle with addiction. To lose one child is a parent's worst nightmare. To lose two in such tragic and painful circumstances is a sorrow almost too great to comprehend. Yet, through it all, Lady Anne continued to perform her duties. She would leave her home, where she was nursing a dying son, to attend an official engagement with Princess Margaret, her face a perfect mask of serene composure. No one in the receiving line, no one reading the society pages, could have possibly guessed the crushing weight of the grief she carried. Her ability to compartmentalize her public duty and her private anguish is a testament to an almost superhuman level of self-control, a product of the aristocratic ethos of the stiff upper lip that she had been raised with. It was a code that demanded the suppression of personal feeling for the sake of public decorum, a code she upheld at an immense personal cost. But that cost was paid in the silent, unseen hours. It was paid when the car door closed, when the front door of her home was shut against the world, and there were no more smiles to be given or hands to be shaken. It was in the crushing silence of a house that should have been filled with the noise and life of her sons. The composure that was so impeccable in public could give way to a private devastation that left her hollowed out. This wasn't a grief that could be cried out and then put away. It was a constant, leaden presence, a landscape of loss that she had to navigate every single day, entirely on her own. You don't simply get over a sorrow like that. It becomes a part of you. The grief for her sons became a quiet companion, an invisible shadow that walked beside her at every glittering gala and every royal engagement. It reshaped her view of the world, giving her a profound empathy for the suffering of others, but it also created a certain distance. There was a part of her that would forever be in mourning, a private chamber of her heart that was closed to the world. To survive such a loss is not to forget, but to learn how to carry on with the ghosts of those you love, to find a way to live with the empty spaces they have left behind. In the end, that stiff upper lip was both her shield and her cage. It was the tool that allowed her to function, to put one foot in front of the other, to honor her commitments when all she wanted to do was crumble. It was a testament to a strength that few could ever imagine, but it also enforced a profound loneliness, a sense that her deepest pain had to be hidden away. She became the living embodiment of a bygone era's code of conduct, a woman who showed the world a face of perfect, aristocratic grace, while privately carrying a burden of sorrow that would have broken almost anyone else. One of the most emotionally striking and little-known facts that illuminates the depth of her private struggle comes from her own words. She once recalled how, after Henry's death, she was on a royal tour with Princess Margaret in America. They were in Houston, and one evening she simply broke down in her hotel room, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of grief. Princess Margaret came into the room, and instead of offering platitudes or trying to cheer her up, she simply sat with her. She didn't say much. She just stayed, a silent, comforting presence for over an hour. It was a moment of profound, unspoken empathy between two friends who had known each other their entire lives. Margaret, so often portrayed as demanding and difficult, showed in that moment the depth of her compassion and the strength of their bond. It reveals that behind the rigid formalities of their roles, there was a real human connection, a friendship strong enough to withstand the darkest of times. Her marriage to Colin also brought its own unique form of emotional turmoil. In his later years, Lord Glenconner became increasingly eccentric and unpredictable. After suffering a breakdown, he moved permanently to St. Lucia, leaving Anne in England. In a final shocking act of cruelty, he wrote a new will just before his death in 2010, leaving his entire fortune including the family home, not to his wife of 54 years or his children, but to his longtime St. Lucian employee, Kent Adonai. Lady Anne was left with virtually nothing. She had to fight a lengthy and stressful legal battle to reclaim a portion of her inheritance. It was a final painful betrayal from the man with whom she had shared a lifetime of dizzying highs and devastating lows. It was the culmination of a life lived in service to others, her husband, the crown, often at the expense of her own security and well-being. For nearly a decade after her husband's death, and 17 years after the death of Princess Margaret, Lady Anne Glenconner continued to live a quiet life, upholding the code of silence she had honored for so long. The world saw her as a relic of a bygone era, a dignified figure from the Queen's inner circle. No one expected what was to come next. In 2019, at the age of 87, she published her memoir, Lady in Waiting, My Extraordinary Life in the Shadow of the Crown. The book was an instant international sensation. It wasn't just another royal biography filled with recycled gossip. This was different. This was a primary source account from the ultimate insider, told with warmth, wit, and a startling degree of honesty. For the first time, the public was given a nuanced, three-dimensional portrait of Princess Margaret. Anne wrote with deep affection, but she did not shy away from the princess's famous wit, her demanding nature, or her moments of vulnerability. She painted a picture of a woman who was complex, intelligent, and often deeply unhappy, trapped by the circumstances of her birth. The publication inevitably sparked a degree of controversy. The very act of writing such a book was a breach of the unspoken aristocratic and royal code of discretion. To some, it may have seemed like a betrayal of the trust Princess Margaret had placed in her. Why, after a lifetime of silence, did she choose to speak out now? The decision was partly practical. After being disinherited by her husband, she needed to earn a living. But it was also something deeper. In interviews, Lady Anne explained that she wanted to set the record straight. She had grown tired of the often cruel and one-dimensional portrayals of her friend in the media and in popular culture, such as the series The Crown. She felt a duty to present a more truthful, human picture of the woman she had known and loved. Her book forced a historical reevaluation of Princess Margaret by providing intimate eyewitness context to the major events of her life: the Townsend affair, the Snowdon marriage, her life on Mystique. Lady Anne offered a powerful counter-narrative. She showed the human being behind the tabloid caricature. The debate over Margaret's legacy continues, but Anne's testimony has become an indispensable source for anyone seeking to understand the tragic princess. Was Margaret a spoiled and petulant royal, or a victim of a rigid system that had no place for her creative spirit and passionate nature? Lady Anne's account suggests the truth is far more complicated, painting a portrait of a woman who was in many ways both. But perhaps the most significant debate her book opened up was about her own life. It was a stunning act of self-revelation. By writing so candidly about her tumultuous marriage, the devastating loss of her sons, and her own resilience, she shattered the stereotype of the passive, stoic, aristocratic woman. She gave voice to the hidden pain and the immense strength that lay beneath the surface of a life dedicated to duty and decorum. It was a brave and, in its own quiet way, a revolutionary act. She was not just the lady in waiting anymore. She was the protagonist of her own incredible story. The long-term impact of Lady Anne Glenconner's story is multifaceted. On one level, it serves as an invaluable historical document. Her memoir provides one of the last living first-hand accounts of the inner life of the royal family during the second half of the 20th century. It offers a unique window into a world of protocol, tradition, and personal sacrifice that is rapidly fading from memory. Historians and royal commentators will be mining her insights for generations to come, using her testimony to add color, depth, and humanity to the official record of the Windsor dynasty. Her detailed recollections of conversations, private moments, and the emotional climate behind palace walls are a priceless contribution to our understanding of a pivotal era in British history. Culturally, her story has had a profound effect. It arrived at a time of renewed global fascination with the British monarchy, fueled by series like The Crown. But while such shows offer a dramatized version of events, Lady Anne provided something more authentic. Her narrative resonated with millions of people because it was, at its heart, a deeply human story. It reminded us that behind the grand titles and public ceremonies are individuals grappling with universal experiences: love, friendship, heartbreak, betrayal, and grief. She demystified the monarchy without demeaning it, offering a portrait that was both respectful and revealingly honest. But perhaps her most enduring significance lies in her personal legacy. In an age obsessed with instant celebrity and tell-all confessionals, Lady Anne's story offers a different model. She represents the virtues of loyalty, discretion, and fortitude, values that may seem old-fashioned, but possess a timeless power. For over 50 years, she kept her promise of silence, not out of fear, but out of a deep and abiding sense of duty and love for her friend. And yet her decision to finally speak is just as significant. It demonstrates that it is never too late to claim your own narrative, to find your voice, and to share your truth with the world. Her story has become an inspiration, particularly for older women, showing that a life of service to others does not have to mean the erasure of self. She proved that one can be both a loyal friend and a powerful storyteller, both a keeper of secrets and a revealer of truths. Her life teaches us about resilience, about the capacity of the human spirit to endure unimaginable loss and emerge not broken, but with a quiet wisdom and a story worth telling. She is more than just a footnote in royal history. She is a testament to a life lived with extraordinary grace under extraordinary pressure, a life that ultimately found its powerful concluding chapter in the simple, courageous act of putting pen to paper. In the end, the story of Lady Anne Glenconner is one of profound duality. It is the story of a life lived in the brightest of spotlights and the deepest of shadows, a life of public duty and intensely private pain. For decades, she was a character in someone else's story, the loyal confidante to a famous princess. She played her part with impeccable grace, her own sorrows and struggles hidden behind a veil of aristocratic composure. But the final act of her life was an unexpected and beautiful reclamation. By sharing her story, she did more than just offer a glimpse behind the palace curtains. She gave voice to the silent grief of a mother, the quiet endurance of a wife, and the unwavering loyalty of a friend. She showed us that a life defined by waiting can, in the end, be a life that refuses to be forgotten. Her legacy is not just in the secrets she kept, but in the powerful human truth she finally chose to share. It is a quiet, dignified, and unforgettable lesson in what it means to live a life of consequence, both in the shadows and ultimately in the light.